Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. Is Israel's war in Gaza tearing apart the Democratic Party in the United States, especially the youngest voters? Let's get to the bottom line. Doesn't Israel have a right to defend itself? Is what it's doing now self-defense? Is Israel committing war crimes? Should criticism of Israel somehow be illegal? How are Palestinians supposed to gain their freedom after decades of being occupied and scattered in the diaspora? All of these are important questions. Is U.S. President Joe Biden right to stand with Israel with no red lines? How many more are supposed to die before there's some kind of a permanent ceasefire? These questions and more are being furiously debated around the world, and America's no exception. In Congress, on university campuses, inside newsrooms here, on social media, and on the streets, the debate on Palestine-Israel has eclipsed almost all other global crises. So where is the Middle East conflict taking American politics? Today we're talking with Katie Halper, host of The Katie Halper Show, and Ryan Grim, Washington bureau chief of The Intercept and author of The Squad, AOC and the Hope of a Political Revolution. So Ryan, let me start with you, and thanks for joining us today, both of you. How hard is it to have a real discussion, a fair American-style 360-degree discussion where we entertain views that are sometimes uncomfortable on the Israel-Palestine crisis today?
If you are censuring half of the debate for expressing their position in that debate, you can't have that debate. It's remarkable. I saw somebody say recently that the second person ever censured by Congress was censured for introducing a congressional resolution to end slavery. To have, that is one of the only times that a member of Congress was censured for speech, and even that was an act, introducing an actual resolution. What Rashida Tlaib has done here is get censured for speech, and so to have a debate, to say here is where I stand.
So I want to pause you. I want you to tell our viewers that may not be following every twist and turn in American politics. What happened with Rashida Tlaib? What does censure mean, and how important is it?
So currently, censure means a lot, but I think it's going to mean increasingly less because of what just happened. And what happened is that, well, first of all, it's a legislative maneuver inside Congress that has no teeth to it. It's just all bark. It just says the sense of the House of Representatives is that this person is bad for this particular conduct. But it's done so infrequently that it has maintained some potency among members of Congress.
So in layperson's language, they're saying to this individual member of Congress, we disdain you.
Exactly. Telling them that they do not belong within the confines of reasonable and respectable people. And people have seen what emanates from the House of Representatives. The extremism that you'll hear, coming from all over the place.
Part of the concern about her comments is her concern about calling Joe Biden, part of a genocide, of kind of coming in and attacking many people within her own party. That's before you get to Israel-Palestine issues.
Jamie Raskin, who is one of the top Democrats in the House, kind of gave a speech on behalf of Rashida, in defense of Rashida Tlaib, saying that he thought that some of what she said, particularly her use of the phrase "from the river to the sea," he called it abhorrent. He said, but I would never discipline her as like a child for saying it. If she's going to be disciplined by anybody, it should be by the voters back in her district, who either support or reject what she says when she's representing them in Washington. She's been elected back into Congress multiple times since first being elected in 2018. And so you can disagree with what somebody says, but to actually discipline them and try to stop them from saying it means you're never going to move beyond the place where you're at now. Because when Jamie Raskin told her, I think that's what you said is abhorrent, that enabled her to then say, here's what I mean by river to the sea. I understand what you're saying. Here's what I'm saying. And you're not going to move forward without that.
Right. Katie, I just want to ask you, because you've been a victim in this too, of how hard is it to have an honest discussion, even if it, that tries to open people's aperture as to just jumping on a team?
Right. And so I think you're referring to the fact that I was banned and fired from The Hill, where I used to appear every week the show Rising because I made a video. I wrote a monologue that they didn't let me air. I had to air it elsewhere. But basically defending Rashida Tlaib and her claim that Israel is an apartheid state. And I made the case that it was indeed an apartheid state by the definition of apartheid, which exists. It's not really a subjective question. And people ranging from South African leaders to Israeli prime ministers themselves have acknowledged that it's apartheid. So I definitely experienced firsthand the censorious atmosphere in which you are allowed or not allowed to talk about these things. But of course, you know, I want to be clear that the people who are most suffering from this are the people of Gaza, the people of Palestine, Arab Americans who are being told that they don't matter, that their pain doesn't matter, Muslim Americans, and the very people in Gaza who are right now being ethnically cleansed, bombed out of their homes. In an act that I agree with Rashida Tlaib, I think this is a question of genocide. And I'm not a genocide expert, but I defer to the experts in this field who have said that it's genocidal. One interesting thing is that often the hardest thing to prove with genocide is the genocidal intent. And Israel has done the world a favor by making their genocidal intent clear, by saying out loud. You had the president saying that there were no civilians, basically. He actually said this rhetoric of civilians is ridiculous. All these people are responsible because they voted in Hamas, which is a crazy thing to say because the last election was 2006, and half of Gaza's population is children. You've had Netanyahu citing the Bible and Amalek and making these comments about wiping out men, women, children, suckling the oxen. You've had the justice minister talk about human animals. So it's been very clear. And I think Rashida Tlaib is right. I think what's shameful is not what Rashida Tlaib has said. What's shameful is that the United States is complicit in these acts of genocide that are taking place in Gaza right now as we speak.
So let me ask you this. You know, I read the press as best I can in Tel Aviv, from the political right to the political left, and, you know, try to be a regular, to understand what's going on. And I see a very robust debate going on in Israel. But when I see similar debate go on abroad, people pay a price.
Right. You have Rashida Tlaib being punished for saying something that you can say in Haaretz, one of the leading Israeli newspapers. I mean, I have family in Israel. I'm Jewish. I lost family to the Holocaust. I understand that what happened October 7th was incredibly painful, horrific, tragic. That also does not mean that you are able to commit war crimes to avenge those killings. And of course, history doesn't start on October 7th. A lot of people in the media are framing it as if it does, but there is an active occupation. And part of the reason that Hamas was able to make the gains that they made on October 7th is because so much of the army was at the West Bank helping settlers harass, steal the olives, and kill Palestinians.
Ryan, I'm interested in why all this passion on college campuses and newspapers wasn't there the day before. And you've written a book called The Squad, AOC and the Hope of a Political Revolution. And you identified, as I understand it, this divide over Palestine being one of the formative elements of identity of the Squad, well before this incident happened. So tell us about that.
And it actually came externally. It came from the outside. In other words, it came from outside the Squad. When the Squad, and also Justice Democrats, the kind of...
And tell our audience who the Squad is.
So the Squad would be Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, and Ayanna Pressley. It has since expanded to include people like Cori Bush, Jamal Bowman, Summer Lee, who you've seen be among the most kind of outspoken critics of Israel over the years. But when they started in 2018, and I talked to the founders about this, Israel-Palestine was not at all central to what they were doing. They were trying to raise the minimum wage. They were trying to get health care for everybody. They were trying to do a Green New Deal, focused on climate change, working class issues. Basically the Bernie Sanders agenda from the first time he ran for president. That included Palestinian dignity. It wasn't as if he completely ignored it, but it was by no means central to his campaign. In February of 2019, just a couple of days after they were sworn in, you had the launch of this group called Democratic Majority for Israel, which was basically spun out of AIPAC. AIPAC, as I'm sure your listeners know, is the the major kind of pro-Israel lobby here in the United States, but it wasn't involved as a super PAC in elections. It wasn't spending enormous amounts of money in individual races. It was collecting from people, and people would donate to candidates, but it hadn't yet become a gigantic super PAC. So DMFI did that. And it was launched not in response to anything Rashida Tlaib or Ilhan Omar did in particular. It was just in response to them being sworn in. Because now you had two Muslim members of Congress who were going to unapologetically stand up on behalf of Palestinian rights. And that was something that required its own kind of counterforce. And the first money they spent was against Bernie Sanders in 2020, then Jamal Bowman in 2020, who knocked off Elliot Engel, who I'm sure you've interviewed many times. One of the most outspoken Israel hawks in Congress. He was the House Foreign Affairs chair. And so for him to lose to Jamal Bowman, a member of the squad, really shocked the kind of pro-Israel advocacy world. And that's when AIPAC decided to also get in. So now you have not just DMFI spending $5 to $10 million a year going after progressive Democrats, but AIPAC spending more than $30 million trying to shape primaries. And it ended up that Israel-Palestine became, through no choice of the squad's own, the issue that kind of dominated their time in Congress. They came into office trying to do the same thing: raise the minimum wage, expand access to health care, reverse climate change, generally produce the social democracy that Bernie Sanders envisioned in his campaign. Instead, it was remarkable to go back while I was researching the book to realize just how much of their time in office was spent on this.
I've been interested in how zero-sum this debate has become over many years. That there used to be, there's J Street, which is a rival to AIPAC. There are people I've seen along the way: Daniel Levy, Yossi Beilin, whom I've interviewed, leading Israeli government officials who've also had concern for this in a way there. And so they could play on both sides and look at the whole without looking at, one has to win and the other has to lose. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It does. And what's interesting, the difference between Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar and AOC, for instance, that AOC and also Summer Lee, who won election in 2022, both of them said that they had really never spent any time thinking about this issue. Like in 2018, AOC did this kind of famous flop of an interview where afterwards, and actually in the interview, she said, look, she kind of just gave up. She's like, I'm not an expert on geopolitics. Like, this isn't my issue. And like later I talked to her about it, she said, this wasn't something that for Puerto Rican families in the Bronx was just discussed around the kitchen table. And so there's a reflexive kind of sympathy for the occupied population. But beyond that, you haven't thought about the details of 1948 or 67 or 73. And so at that point, there becomes kind of a tussle, a back and forth over who's going to win her allegiance on this issue. And I think that Israeli politics has gone so far to the right that there isn't kind of an element left in Israeli politics that has any serious social or political base that could reach out to them and say, look, ally yourself with us, and that's how we're going to get to a two-state solution. Because nobody serious over there believes that a two-state solution is possible.
We could do a show here on how, in my view, how incompetent and insolvent the Palestinian leadership side is, But Katie, to come to you on the broad side of the American political scene and these issues, one of the interesting things, we just had an election in this country, in the United States, and the Democrats did rather well. But Joe Biden's popularity is sinking right now.
Yeah, I mean, Arab American support in this in particular is plummeting. You see a lot of, I would say, justifiable rage in the face of what's happening now. I don't think there's a middle ground here. I think that the United States is funding one side. It's funding Israel. Israel is committing war crimes. They're not distinguishing between civilians and Hamas. And I think that it's a joke that Rashida Tlaib is the one who's getting in trouble when you had Republican members of Congress talk about flattening Gaza or flattening Palestine into a parking lot. You had another Republican comparing Palestinian civilians to Nazis. I think that Rashida Tlaib is kind of alone in being a morally consistent voice on this issue. I think she understands that these people in Palestine are real people. She understands that she can't move back into her family's home. I, as a Jew, could move to Israel today and become a citizen. She can't even get back into her family's house that they lived in recently. So I think that the other thing is, in terms of both sides, I mean, it's not helpful to Israel to do what they're doing. It's also not good for Jews, because Israel claims falsely, I would say, to represent all Jews. They certainly don't represent me. They certainly don't represent the Jews of Jewish Voice for Peace who were at the Statue of Liberty on Monday, who took over Grand Central Station the other day, who were in Washington, D.C. Recently. I think that this is an extremist government in Israel, and what they're doing is extremist. And the United States is aiding and abetting in that. And in fact, they should not be doing that because of the Leahy Law, which says that you should not be funding people or governments that are engaged in human rights abuses, which they obviously are. I mean, every human rights organization with any credibility is condemning what Israel's doing.
So, Katie, what is the off-ramp here, from your perspective? And I know that you've been in Israel, you've done, journalism to kind of look at the infrastructure of division, of control. How do you, I've asked some members of Congress I've been talking to who've been making the point to me that we've got to, despite the rage and emotion of the moment, begin thinking about what happens later. Otherwise, this is yet again another forever war. Lots of children down the road, both Israeli and Palestinian, will die decades from now if this isn't there. But how do you see any constructive way to possibly look at an off-ramp to this?
Well, one more point I would just add to that in terms of how this is harmful for Israel and Israelis is that, a ceasefire would also be good for the hostages. If people who I would say either stupidly or cynically claim to really care about the hostages, those people should be calling for a ceasefire, because if you want them released while they're alive, you need a ceasefire so that they're not literally bombed in the buildings that they're being held in. But I think there just needs to be equal rights, the end of the occupation of Israel, of Palestinians in Israel, and equality under the law, equal rights for Muslims, Jews, and Christians, just like there is in every other country.
Ryan, this could grow exponentially worse.
Right. And you often hear the Israeli government say that they're justified in attacking the civilian population because the civilian population supports Hamas.
Right.
That is morally absurd.
Well, let me ask you both.
But if that's true,
ridiculous.
Think about it. If that's true,
Right.
Yeah.
the next regime that comes in to replace Hamas will also be similar to that.
You know what I've been
Also,
trying to
if
get in
that's
my
true,
head?
what are they
Go ahead,
saying
Katie.
about Israelis? Well, what are they saying about Israelis? Israel voted for Netanyahu, right?
Right. It would be obscene to say that
is Hamas
right,
justified
exactly.
in doing what they do to civilians because they voted for Netanyahu? Because we can point to lots of crimes against humanity and international law violations that Israel's engaged in.
Oh, because we're getting close to the end here. I also want to ask you, the other thing going through my mind is how this plays geopolitically. And I would say to you that I had Daniel Levy, who's a very well-known person, heads the U.S. Middle East Project. He was an Israeli negotiator around the Oslo Accords and the Geneva Initiative. And he said, quote unquote, on this show, "It is pathetic how little President Biden got in terms of humanitarian relief and concessions." John Kirby, Admiral John Kirby, a spokesman for the National Security Council, said in a call I was on that Israel was at one point opposed to any humanitarian aid getting through, so that any aid getting through was because of the U.S. doing that. But it raised really interesting questions about, how much power we have in this. What we do have power for is delivering weapons and saying, hey, there are no limits on those weapons, as we impose on Saudi Arabia and other places around the world when we ship weapons. Is this a one-way street where America is a supplicant and has no power in this relationship? Or is it something we have to kind of cheerlead and finally we get some influence down the road? Katie?
No, it's a choice. I mean, Biden could end this right now if he wanted to. That would be the right thing to do. Morally, it would be strategic for him because he's going to maybe lose the next election over this. I don't think that's inconceivable. The Zogby brothers, who are pollsters, have been looking at the data, and they are they've gone down significantly, especially among the Arab American population. Young people care about this issue. Black voters care about this issue. Latino voters care about this issue. And I think that Biden is not just making a huge moral mistake, and this is someone who presented himself as morally superior to Donald Trump, right? He opposed the Muslim ban. I think what he's doing now is not standing at all with Muslim Americans, with Arab Americans, with Muslims and Palestinians who are being ethnically cleansed right now as we speak. And I think it's an embarrassment, and the U.S. has no moral authority here. If Biden wants to regain any moral authority, he would have to actually stop what Israel's doing right now, and then work on ending the occupation. But at the very least, a ceasefire is the bare minimum that you have to do, because children, women, innocent civilians are being killed, and Israel isn't even hiding it. They're just making up different excuses, totally distorting how international human rights law works, talking about human shields, which is, it's a whole other conversation, because according to Amnesty International, actually Israel uses human shields much more than Hamas does. They misuse that term. It doesn't mean that you have, that's a whole other issue. But yeah, Biden is acting, it's shameful. And I think the whole world looks at us as total hypocrites.
Right.
And cowards.
Thank you, Ryan. I want to get you very quickly in here. You know, basically, are you surprised at how little the Biden administration has got when it's asked for humanitarian pauses, when it's asked for aid relief, when it's asked for adjustments around these issues? It seems thus far, I am surprised that Joe Biden has not been more successful in turning Netanyahu a slightly less.
Yeah, I think Netanyahu has kind of recognized that the Biden administration isn't that serious about what they're asking for. That if they were, they would be more likely to deliver. So there's a wink and a nod that Israel may be getting there. I think the bottom line is that nothing surprises me, because I expected world leaders after Jared Kushner left the White House to just abandon the work that he did. This was a guy who came into the White House because he was married to Ivanka Trump, and Ivanka Trump's dad became president, and he decided he was going to bring about Middle East peace by ignoring the Palestinian question. I thought that was so obviously stupid that the second that he was gone, adults would get back in the room and they would try to sort it out like adults would. Instead, they took that guy's plan and tried to roll with it, and this is what we got as a result.
Very few people have articulated that way. It's very compelling. Katie Halper, star of The Katie Halper Show, and Ryan Grimm, star of The Intercept. Congratulations on your new book,
Thanks,
which
Dave.
I really look forward to reading. Thank you both so much for being with us today.
Thanks.
So what's the bottom line? I read the Israeli press regularly, from the political left to the political right. The debate inside Israel about the solvency of its democracy, on how to characterize the opposition, on how to deal with the fallout of October 7th, on how to deal with Hamas, what to do after the war is over, and what people think about Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Those debates in Israel are ferocious, robust, multifaceted. But in America, the debate is much more binary. Two sides, no shades of gray, and people pay with their careers and status on some occasions if they say something that offends. It's literally dangerous to have strong opinions in the U.S. America's professed values are those that embrace debate, diversity, and point versus counterpoint in the struggle to get things right. America risks both its relevance in the world and the solvency of its own democracy if it shuts down that debate and tries to squelch those voices who raise uncomfortable views. And that's the bottom line.